Vincent Calder looked at the motorcycle for exactly 53 seconds. Then he said, $20. The garage went so quiet you could hear the heat pressing against the metal roof. Clara Maddox didn't move. She was 56 years old, and she had been preparing herself for a low number. She knew that much. She had told herself to be ready. But $20 landed differently than a low number. $20 was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. The motorcycle was a 1963 Triumph Bonneville T, 120, cream and black, covered in the dust of 6 still years. It sat in the back of Barlow's garage behind a canvas tarp that Hank Barlow had just pulled away, and in the afternoon light that came through the high windows, even under the dust, it was unmistakably a machine that had been loved. The chrome was dull but unbroken. The engine cases showed no cracks, no falls, no damage hidden under paint. The leather saddlebag on the left side was dry and stiff but whole. Whoever had put this motorcycle away had done it the way you put something away when you plan to come back to it. Earl Maddox had planned to come back to it. He never got the chance. "I was told you were a serious buyer," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It had taken years to make it that steady. "I am serious." Calder smiled the way men smile when they believe the outcome is already settled. He wore a light gray suit despite the July heat, and his shoes were city shoes that had no business on a small-town concrete floor. He was 48 years old, and had the unhurried posture of a man accustomed to waiting out the people in front of him. "Which is why I'm being honest with you, Mrs. Maddox. This machine has been sitting unused for 6 years. The seals are dry. The carburetors are gummed past the point of simple cleaning. I'd have to put $200 into it before it saw a road again. 20 is a fair price for what it is today." "It was Earl's," Clara said. "I know what it was," Calder said. "I'm telling you what it is now." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded envelope. He set it on the workbench between them with a calm, unhurried hand, the gesture of a man who has done this before, in other garages, with other widows, and looked at her with the patient expression of someone who has already decided to wait. Tommy Maddox stood 6 feet behind his grandmother, his back against the rear wall, watching. He was 15. He had the look of a boy who has learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms where adults are managing things. He had grown up with the Maddox name the way you grow up with a bruise that won't quite heal, always there, always tender when someone pressed on it. At school, 2 boys had called his grandfather a cheat the previous spring, and Tommy had not argued back because he did not know enough of the truth to argue, only enough of the shame to go quiet. He had heard the story in pieces over the years, a race in 1964, an accusation, a reputation that came apart the way things come apart in small towns, fast and permanent, and he had never found the version that made his grandfather into anything other than a man who had done something wrong and never admitted it. He stared at the envelope on the workbench. $20. The garage on Birch Road had been called Maddox & Sons once. There had never been sons, only Earl's apprentices and Earl's philosophy that a clean engine was an honest engine. The sign said Barlow's now. But the ghost of the old letters was still visible through the paint in certain light, and the afternoon was doing that right now, throwing the shadow of Earl's name across the cracked concrete, faint and stubborn, as if even the building hadn't entirely agreed to forget him. Hank Barlow stood to the side with a rag he didn't need to wipe, not looking at anyone directly. The front door of the garage opened. No one turned right away. The light from outside was bright, and the figure who stepped in was just a shape against the glare, medium height, lean, a leather jacket despite the warmth, moving without announcement. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at the Triumph. Not at the conversation. Not at Calder or Clara or the envelope on the bench. He looked at the motorcycle the way a man looks at something he already knows how to read slowly, from the engine outward, with the particular attention of someone for whom machines are not objects but sentences. Nobody turned to look at the man in the jacket right away. He moved along the wall, hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped near an old engine block that had been sitting on a metal shelf since before Hank Barlow changed the sign. He was quiet in the way that certain men are quiet, not invisible, but without making a claim on the room, the way someone stands when they are listening very carefully and prefer not to be noticed while they do. Clara Maddox was still looking at the envelope on the workbench. She had come close to selling the Triumph twice before. Once, the year after Earl died, when a neighbor offered $40. She had said no then. 40 had felt like an insult, but she had also not been ready. The second time, 2 years ago, when a boy from the next town over offered 50 for the whole bike. She had told him she needed to think about it. She had thought for 3 days and then never called him back. $20 was not an offer. It was a calculation. It was Calder looking at her situation, the part-time school job, the quilts she sold at the church market in October, the bills that arrived in envelopes that felt heavier than they should, and naming a number that she couldn't easily refuse. And her position, she could not deny, was fragile. Earl had left almost nothing. There was the house and the small plot behind it, paid off before he died. There were his tools on the shelf. She could still see his name scratched into the handles, and there was the Triumph, which she had not touched in 6 years, not since the morning they came to take his body. She thought about what the Triumph had meant to him. Earl Maddox had been a mechanic's mechanic, the kind of man other mechanics called when they couldn't figure something out. He had worked at this garage for 16 years, before buying a half-share from old Gil Barlow, Hank's father. He had raced on weekends, not for money or standing, but because he loved the feeling of a well-tuned machine running exactly as it should. He raced for the same reason he fixed engines, because in those two things, everything was either right or wrong, and there was no room for politics, and no room for pretending. The Triumph had been his best work. He had built it up over 2 years. Every adjustment, every setting, every piece was his chosen carefully, fitted precisely, documented in his neat handwriting, in a small notebook he kept in the saddlebag along with his tools. It was not just a motorcycle. It was the clearest record of what Earl Maddox knew how to do. And then, in the summer of 1964, the Creekside Classic had happened. The story, as Sycamore Flats told it, was simple. A brake component failed on another rider's machine during the race. The rider went into the gravel at speed, broke bones, walked away barely. Someone looked at the failed component, and someone else mentioned that Earl Maddox had been seen near multiple machines in the days before the race. The accusation was never formally made in a courtroom. It didn't need to be. In a small town, a story told by the right people in the right places has its own kind of jurisdiction. Earl said he hadn't touched the brakes. He said it clearly, to anyone who would listen. Not enough people had. The shop survived because of Hank Barlow, who had quietly assumed control. Earl worked there in reduced capacity, a man diminished in the only community that had ever fully made sense to him, until he died 2 years later, quieter than he had been, and sadder. The Triumph unfinished in the back, the carburetor still needing work he had ordered a part for and never finished. Pete Lang, who had won the Creekside Classic that day, the man who crossed the finish line while Earl was standing at the edge of his reputation watching it burn, had gone on to open a restoration shop on 40 Road that was by 1,971 of the most respected in the county. Nobody had connected those two facts out loud, at least not where Clara could hear. She had never stopped believing Earl. But believing and proving were different things, and she had long since accepted that the proof, whatever form it might have taken, was gone. Tommy was watching her from across the garage. He was Earl's blood in ways Clara could see without difficulty, the careful hands, the thought before the word, the stillness that came over him when something troubled him. But he had grown up hearing the town's version of Earl Maddox. 2 boys at school had called his grandfather a cheat last spring, and Tommy had gone quiet rather than argue, because he didn't have the words yet. He spent time near the Triumph, not out of pride, but out of something unresolved, drawn to it the way you return to a question you don't know how to answer. "I need a day to think," Clara said. "The offer is good until close of business today." Calder said it pleasantly. The pleasantness had an edge in it now, faint but precise, like a blade lying flat. "I have other appointments in the region tomorrow. I can't guarantee I'll be back this way." Clara looked at the Triumph one more time. The man near the wall had shifted slightly, not toward the conversation, just repositioning, the way someone does when they are paying close attention and prefer not to appear to be. He was looking at the saddlebag. Vincent Calder had been collecting motorcycles for 11 years. He had 43 machines in a climate-controlled facility outside San Diego, some worth $30,000, some considerably more. He was not a man who needed the Triumph Bonneville T120 for his collection. He was a man who needed it gone from Sycamore Flats. He did not show this. He showed patience. He walked around the garage with Hank Barlow and asked polite questions about the summer and the roads. He complimented the tooling arrangement on the north wall. He accepted a cup of coffee from the tin percolator in the corner and drank it without making a face, which told any careful observer that he was focused on something other than the coffee. He was the kind of man who wore his control like a well-fitted jacket. Nothing loose, nothing that moved without reason. Tommy watched him. The boy had a quality that most adults underestimate in teenagers. He noticed the distance between what people said and what their bodies did. Calder talked about fair pricing and kept glancing, briefly and quickly, at the saddlebag on the Triumph, not at the engine, not at the chrome or the frame, the saddlebag. Each time, his eyes moved there and came back, and each time the interval between was a little shorter. The saddlebag was old brown leather, stitched along the edges, with a brass buckle gone dark with age. It hung on the left side of the motorcycle, below the seat. It looked like something that had not been opened in years. It looked like nothing. Tommy had opened it once, when he was 12. He had found a rag, a small wrench, and what looked like a folded piece of paper. He had not been interested enough to unfold it. He had put everything back and thought nothing more about it. He was thinking about it now. Calder set his coffee cup down and turned back to Clara. "I understand this machine meant something to your husband," he said. "I respect that. But sentiment doesn't change mechanics, Mrs. Maddox. The longer a machine sits, the more the restoration cost compounds. Every month it doesn't run is money off the price." He paused, letting that land. "You're not getting a better offer from someone else. People in this town know the history attached to this machine. That affects value." He said the word history the way you use a word when it is also a warning. Clara looked at him. $20 in a clean transaction, Calder said, is often more dignified than waiting for something that isn't coming. Dignified. The word sat in the room like an insult that hadn't quite decided to announce itself. Hank Barlow shifted his weight from foot to foot. He had been doing it since Calder arrived. The way a man moves when the floor beneath him is not solid. He and Earl had been friends for 20 years. They had shared tools and the particular silence of men who work well together. When the accusation came in 1964, Hank had told anyone who asked that he didn't know what had happened and couldn't say either way. He had believed, at the time, that staying neutral was the same as staying clean. He understood now that there is no such thing as a neutral position when someone's name is being destroyed. He looked at Clara's face and could not hold her eyes. The man by the wall had moved again. He had stepped closer to the Triumph, close enough now to see the saddlebag clearly, still far enough that he could have been simply standing. "Mind if I look at the bike?" he asked. The voice was even, not loud, not demanding. A simple question from a man who looked like he might know what he was seeing. Calder turned. Clara looked at the stranger for the first time with real attention. He was lean and sun-worn, wearing a jacket that had done actual road miles. His face didn't advertise itself. But his eyes, when they found hers, were steady in a way she recognized the eyes of someone who had spent more hours inside engine bays than boardrooms. "This is a private transaction," Calder said. "I'm not interrupting," the man said. "I'll just look." He walked to the Triumph without waiting for permission. He crouched beside the engine. He looked at the front forks, the cables, the throttle housing, the brake lines. He was not performing the examination, he was doing it, with the unhurried precision of someone who actually needed the information. Then he pressed one hand gently against the left saddlebag. It gave slightly, not empty. The Triumph Bonneville T120 was not a rare motorcycle in 1970. There were thousands on American roads, and hundreds more in garages, barns, and backyards in various states of disrepair. A man who knew engines could spot the difference between one that had been neglected and one that had been cared for, even under years of dust. It was a vocabulary written in metal and rubber and oil residue, not obvious to everyone, but unmistakable to the right reader. The man in the leather jacket read it slowly. He looked at the engine cases first. No stress cracks, no impact damage, no evidence of a hard fall that had been hidden rather than repaired. He looked at the primary chain cover and the condition of the mounting bolts, still seated properly, not stripped. He looked at the ignition timing marks, the carburetors, the brake lines on both ends of the machine. The bike had been serviced carefully, probably less than 6 months before it stopped being ridden. Whoever had done the last work knew what they were doing. The adjustments were precise. Not a dealership job, a craftsman's job. "When did the bike last run?" he asked. Hank answered before Clara could. 6 years at least. Maybe 7. Somebody kept it clean for a while after it stopped running, the man said. Oil changed, seals treated. That work was done after it stopped being ridden, recently enough to matter. Hank said nothing. The man looked at Clara. Did you do that? Earl did, she said. In the last year before he passed. He said he was going to restore it eventually. He ordered a part. I don't know if it came. What was wrong with it? Carburation, he said. He was going to fix it when he had time. The man nodded slowly. He knew what it meant when a man like that kept maintaining a machine he could no longer ride. It meant the machine mattered. It meant he wasn't ready to let go of what it represented. Calder watched from across the garage, his expression controlled, his jaw set with an effort most people would not notice. I'm sorry, Calder said. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm just looking, the man said. I understand that, but this is a private negotiation, and I don't think... He can look, Clara said. The garage went quiet in a different way than before. Calder absorbed this without expression. He looked at Hank, who looked at the floor. The man straightened and stood beside the motorcycle. He was not a large man, but he stood in a way that suggested he had stopped requiring other people's permission for things some time ago. You came a long way to look at a machine you say needs 200 in labor, he said to Calder. He said it simply, without accusation, the way you state something observable. I was told it was available, Calder said. That's a Lincoln Continental rental outside, the man said. Sycamore Flats doesn't have a direct flight from anywhere. You planned this trip, which means you researched first. Calder said nothing. A man who researches a motorcycle he's going to offer $20 for, the man said, is either very thorough or very motivated. Which is it? The question sat in the air and didn't move. Tommy had stopped breathing normally. He was watching the stranger with the fixed attention of someone who has just seen another person name a thing that everyone around them had been carefully not naming. Clara looked at the man. You know motorcycles, she said. Some, he said. You know this one's worth more than 20. He paused. $20 buys scrap, he said. It doesn't buy a man's name. Calder's jaw tightened. I don't know who you are, he started. That doesn't matter much right now, the man said. He looked at the saddlebag. Can I open this? He asked Clara. She looked at the bag. 6 years she had left it untouched. Earl had packed it last. She had not opened it since the morning they came for his body. Yes, she said. The brass buckle on the saddlebag had gone stiff with years of stillness. The man worked it carefully, not forcing it, using both thumbs to ease the mechanism the way you ease something that has not moved in a long time. The leather around the buckle was hard and pale at the fold lines, and it resisted like it had forgotten what it was for. Then the buckle gave, and the leather flap folded back. The sound of it was small in the quiet garage. A whisper of old leather releasing. Calder took one step forward. The man in the jacket didn't look up. You can stay where you are, he said. Still quiet. The way you say something when you don't expect to have to say it twice. Calder stopped. Something in the certainty of it, not a threat. Just an absolute made stopping feel like the obvious choice. Tommy had moved without realizing it. He was now standing 2 feet from his grandmother, close enough that she could feel him there. Hank Barlow had backed up a half step, as if he needed distance from whatever was about to be found. Clara stood completely still. The man looked inside the saddlebag. He did not take everything out at once. He reached in slowly and placed each item on the seat of the Triumph in the order he found it. First, a folded work cloth, stiff with dried oil. He set it aside. Second, a small adjustable wrench, rusted at the pivot point. He turned it once in his hand and set it on the cloth. Third, a receipt from a parts supplier, folded into quarters, the paper browned at the edges. He opened it partway and looked at it without reading it aloud. He refolded it and set it beside the wrench. Fourth, a manila envelope, sealed with tape. The tape had dried and come partially loose at one corner. The envelope was thick enough to hold several pages. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and set it down on the seat where everyone could see it. Fifth, a photograph, face down. He turned it over. It was black and white, a motorcycle at the start line of a race, number 14 on the fairing. Beside the machine stood a man in a racing jacket, not smiling, but not unhappy either. The expression of a man concentrating, fully present, not performing anything for anyone. You could see in his posture that he had spent a lot of time on machines like this one, that the race mattered to him but not more than the preparation that had led to it. Behind him, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was another machine and another rider. The second rider was looking directly at the first man's rear wheel. "Who's this?" the man asked Clara. Clara walked to him slowly. She looked at the photograph and something moved in her face, not grief exactly, because she had already passed through the acute part of grief, but something adjacent to it, a kind of recognition that still cost something. "That's Earl," she said. "Race day. The Creekside Classic. 1,964. And the man behind him?" Clara looked more carefully at the second figure, partially cut off at the frame's edge. "I'm not certain. The race has always had so many people." "Hank," the man said. He wasn't looking at Barlow. He was still looking at the photograph. Hank came closer, reluctantly, his feet moving without full participation from the rest of him. He looked at the photograph. Something happened in his face, a small collapse, like a wall giving a centimeter along a crack that had always been there. "That's Pete Lang," he said. And then he caught himself, as if the name had come out before he'd decided to let it. "Pete Lang," the man repeated. "Local racer." Hank's voice was careful now. "He won the Creekside in '64. He stopped. "After the accusation," Clara said. Hank nodded, looking at the floor. The man picked up the manila envelope. "This was sealed," he said to Clara. "You didn't know what was in it?" "I couldn't bring myself to go through his things," Clara said. "I kept meaning to. I never did." He looked at the tape along the edge. Dry, brittle, years old. Then he looked at Calder. "What do you think is in here?" he asked him. Not as an accusation, just as curiosity. The kind of curiosity that already has an answer. Calder said nothing. The man opened the envelope. The envelope contained 3 pages. The first was handwritten in a neat, mechanical script, the hand of someone trained to be precise. It was dated the 9th of July, 1964, 12 days before the Creekside Classic. The man read it without speaking. Then he read it a second time. He set it gently on the seat of the Triumph and looked at the wall for a moment, the way men look at something that isn't there when they are deciding something about what comes next. "Can I read it?" Clara asked. "It's your letter," he said. She picked it up. Her eyes moved through the first paragraph and stopped. Her hand dropped slightly, the paper tilting down, and then she caught it and held it steady and kept reading. The letter was from Earl to himself, not addressed to anyone, not written as a complaint or an accusation, written the way a mechanic writes a diagnostic note, careful, sequential, factual. Here is what it said, in plain terms. 2 days before the Creekside Classic, Earl Maddox had gone to retrieve a torque wrench he had lent to Pete Lang's crew. When he reached Lang's machine, he found a problem. The brake caliper on the front wheel had been mounted incorrectly, the bolt holding it was finger-tight instead of torqued, and the caliper was oriented in a way that meant it would shift under hard braking. Not immediately dangerous at low speed. Catastrophic above 60 miles an hour. The kind of failure that happens in the third lap of a race, when everything is going fast and there is no room for a front brake that decides to move. Earl had not gone looking for problems. He had simply gone to get his wrench and found one. He fixed it, without asking, without announcing it, without telling Lang's crew what he had found. He tightened the caliper correctly, replaced the mounting bolt with a good one from his own kit, and left. He wrote down exactly what he had done, including the part number and the torque specification, and he sealed the note in an envelope and put it in his saddlebag, because that was how Earl Maddox handled things that mattered. He documented them. He had probably not told Lang directly because doing so would have required admitting that he had been on another man's machine without invitation. In Earl's code, even being right didn't give you permission to look wrong. On race day, it was not Pete Lang's machine that failed. It was Roy Garrett's a different rider, a different make of motorcycle, a different brake system entirely. Garrett went into the gravel on the third lap, broke bones, and was lucky to walk away. Afterward, people noticed that Earl had been seen near multiple machines in the days before the race. Someone said he might have been tampering. Someone else repeated it. The story spread the way stories spread in small towns, filling in the spaces left by the absence of facts. Earl had touched only one machine that didn't belong to him. He had fixed a dangerous problem on it. He had written it all down, and then he had put the paper in a sealed envelope and kept it in his saddlebag and never shown it to anyone, because by the time the accusation came, he was too proud and too tired and too much himself to defend himself by revealing what he had done for a man who had not once stood up for him. The second page was the part number and torque specification, mechanical confirmation of every word in the letter. The third page was a receipt from a supplier in Bakersfield, dated that same week. 2 replacement brake caliper mounting bolts, OEM spec, with Earl's name at the top and a handwritten note in the margin. For repair race prep check. The man in the leather jacket had understood all of this by the end of the first page. Clara finished reading. She set the letter down and stood very still, her hand flat on the seat of the Triumph, not pressing, just resting, feeling the metal under her palm. Tommy had not read it yet. He had watched his grandmother's face while she read it, and he had seen something change in her, not break, change the way a window changes when the light through it finally comes from the right direction. "He fixed it," Tommy said. Clara looked at him. "Grandpa found the bad part and fixed it," Tommy said, "before the race, and then someone else's machine failed and they blamed him anyway." "Yes," Clara said. Tommy looked at the photograph on the seat of the Triumph, Earl at the start line, Pete Lang behind him, watching Earl's rear wheel. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Calder. Calder had not moved. His briefcase was in his right hand, and his driving gloves were folded in his left, and his face was very controlled, because controlling his face was the only thing left he could do. "You didn't come for the motorcycle," the man in the jacket said to him. His voice was still level, still quiet. "You came for what Earl left inside it." Calder said nothing. The man let the silence stand. Hank Barlow had backed up 2 steps. His face had gone the color of old concrete. "You knew this was in here," the man said. He was still looking at Calder, still quiet. Calder didn't answer. "That's why $20, the man said. "Not because the bike is worthless, because you wanted the papers gone." By 4 o'clock, 3 more people had found their way to Barlow's garage. This was not entirely an accident. Ruthie Bell had been watching from the diner window across Creekside Avenue since Calder's Continental pulled up, because Ruthie Bell had a habit of watching things that didn't quite add up. She had run the diner for 11 years and had developed opinions about the range of human behavior that she did not share unless asked, and sometimes when she wasn't. When the man in the leather jacket walked into the garage and did not come out, she had called across twice and gotten no answer, and eventually untied her apron and walked over herself, leaving the closed sign on the door without ceremony. She stood now in the garage doorway. She had not read the letter. She didn't need to. She had read the room the moment she stepped in, and the room told her enough. Ruthie Bell had known Earl Maddox for 20 years. She had served him coffee every workday morning, black, in the same white mug she kept on the third hook. She had watched what the accusation did to him, not all at once, but incrementally, the way weather damages a building, and she had always thought the story the town told about him was too neat. Real guilt, in her experience, looked messier than what Earl had shown. Real guilt didn't go that quiet. She had never said this out loud to anyone. She was now reconsidering that decision. Deputy Frank Weller had not been called. He had pulled up in his cruiser out of habit. The Lincoln Continental parked in front of Barlow's had registered on his mental radar during his afternoon loop, and Frank Weller had learned, over 30 years of small-town policing, that expensive out-of-state cars in front of modest garages rarely meant anything uncomplicated. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking at the scene with the expression of a man who was starting to understand that a story he accepted a long time ago may have had a different ending. 2 younger mechanics from the far bay had stopped their work and drifted to the doorway. They were not part of any of it. But they were present. And in small towns, witness is its own kind of weight. Calder had recalibrated. He stood with his arms crossed now, wearing the expression of a man who is trying to become the reasonable person in an unreasonable room. "I want to be clear," he said. "Whatever documents were in that bag, they're personal papers belonging to the Maddox estate. I came here to make a purchase offer, which I had every right to do. I'm not responsible for what anyone may have done or said in 1964. "Nobody said you were," the man in the jacket said. "Then I don't see why." "The mood shifted because you offered $20 for a motorcycle you knew contained evidence that cleared a dead man's name," the man said. "And because Clara Maddox almost sold it to you." The garage was quiet. "Frank," Hank said. Weller looked at him. Hank Barlow was 62 years old and had been carrying his particular version of this moment for 6 years. He had told himself, repeatedly and in various formulations, that he had done nothing wrong in 1964. He had not accused Earl. He had not started the story. He had only declined to contradict it, and declining to contradict something is not the same as lying. He had believed this until he looked at Clara reading that letter. "You were there that day," Hank said to Weller. His voice was rough. "At the Creekside Classic." "I was there," Weller said. "I've never denied it. And you heard what people were saying about Earl." "There was nothing official to—" "You didn't look," Hank said. "You heard it and you took the easy version and you moved on. And so did I." He looked at Clara. He looked at her for the first time without flinching away. "I was his partner for 20 years. I knew Earl Maddox better than anyone in this town. And when they said it, I told people I didn't know what had happened." He stopped. "I knew. I just didn't say." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said quietly. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it as a fact that had been true for a long time and was now, finally, allowed to be said out loud. Tommy picked up the photograph from the seat of the Triumph. He looked at Pete Lang's face at the edge of the frame, watching Earl's rear wheel. He set it back down and looked at the man in the leather jacket. "Who are you?" Tommy asked. Direct, without apology, the way a 15-year-old asks a question, when he has run out of patience for the things adults don't say. The man looked at him for a moment. "Steve," he said. Ruthie Bell was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, no apron, no dish towel, just Ruthie being Ruthie. She had been watching the man since she walked in, doing what she always did, which was look carefully and say nothing until she was certain. She was the kind of woman who only spoke when she was sure, and who was usually sure before anyone else in the room. She looked at his face now, the jaw, the eyes, the way he held himself when nobody was paying attention to him. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, brief and private, that meant she had confirmed what she suspected. Then she looked back at Clara, and her expression said, "Whatever this man decides to do next, let him." Steve McQueen had not planned to stop in Sycamore Flats. He had been riding up through the valley on a Triumph of his own, a different model, newer, but still a Triumph because he had opinions about motorcycles the way he had opinions about engines and tires, and the particular silence that comes on a road in the hour before sunset. He had planned to make Bakersfield by evening. His bike had developed a fueling problem near the county line, the kind of lean stumble that means a clogged jet or a needle worn past its tolerance, and he had pulled into Barlow's because it was the first garage he saw with lights on. He had asked Hank, briefly, if he had a carburetor kit for his model year. Hank had gone to the back to check, and in the time between Hank disappearing and reappearing, Steve had heard Clara's voice and Calder's voice, and had turned from the parts shelf to look at what was happening near the old Triumph. He had not intended to get involved, but $20 for a machine like that, clean engine work, careful preservation, someone's last labor of love sitting under a canvas tarp, had pulled his attention toward the machine. And Calder's eagerness, the quality of it, the slightly too controlled urgency of a man who had flown in from San Diego to offer $20 for something he claimed was scrap, that had pulled his attention toward the Saddlebag. The rest had followed the way things followed when you paid attention to the right detail. He was aware now that Ruthie Bell had recognized him. He could tell by the way she was standing and the particular quality of her stillness. He hoped she would not announce it. He had found, over the years, that being recognized in the middle of something complicated tended to complicate it further. Ruthie Bell looked at the situation in front of her and said nothing, which told him she understood how to read a room. What he needed now was the last piece. "Where's Pete Lang?" he asked, not loudly. Just a question into the room. Hank answered first. "He's got a shop. 40 Road, out past the grain elevator. He doesn't race anymore. Does custom work. Restoration." Steve let that sit. "A restoration shop," he said. "Has for 3-4 years. Does he deal in parts, older British machines?" Hank looked at him with the uncertain expression of a man connecting dots he wishes weren't there. "Sometimes. He's got contacts, buys and sells some." Steve turned to Calder. "You know Pete Lang," he said. Calder's jaw tightened. "I may have spoken with him." "You did or you didn't." A pause. "We've spoken. About the Triumph." Another pause, longer this time. "He mentioned it was available. Calder said finally. He knew Clara was in a difficult situation financially. He thought she might want to sell, and he passed the information along. He passed the information to a collector he knew would offer the least possible amount and ask the least possible questions, Steve said. That's a characterization I don't accept. That's fine, Steve said. He looked at Weller. Those papers, he said, are evidence that the wrong man's reputation was destroyed. Whether that constitutes anything actionable in 1970 for something that happened in 1964, I don't know. That's not my business. But I think it's yours. Weller was still holding the second page of the letter. His face had the look of a man who has been carrying a weight he told himself wasn't heavy and has just been handed a scale. Lang would have known about the papers, Weller said. It was half question, half statement. If he knew Earl had figured out what he'd done to that caliper, Steve said, then yes. He'd have had 6 years to wonder if Earl wrote it down. Clara made a sound small, involuntary, the sound of a connection made. That's why he told Calder, she said. He wasn't doing me a favor. He was trying to make the papers disappear. That's how I read it, Steve said. Tommy had been very quiet through all of this. He was looking at his grandmother. She was not crying. She had not cried during any of it. She was doing something harder than crying. She was reassembling a version of the world she had lived in for 6 years, placing the pieces back in the correct order. Can we go talk to Pete Lang? Tommy asked. It was not clear who he was asking. Steve looked at the boy for a moment. That's a good question, he said. Pete Lang's place on 40 Road was cleaner than it had a right to be. The building was a converted barn, redone with corrugated metal siding and a concrete floor, and it held 6 motorcycles in various states of work, a parts wall that covered the entire north end, and a separate glassed-in area at the back that served as an office. The whole thing had the look of a man who had done well for himself and wanted it visible. Lang was in the back when they arrived. Steve, Clara, Tommy, and Weller, who had driven behind them in the cruiser without officially declaring this any kind of proceeding. Hank had stayed at the garage. He had said he needed to lock up. They had let him go. His part of the reckoning would come later, in the quieter way that private guilt tends to find its terms. Calder had not been invited. He had stood in the parking lot of Barlow's with his briefcase and his driving gloves and watched them leave and done nothing to stop them, because there was nothing left for him to do that would help. Pete Lang came out of the office when he heard the vehicles. He was 57 and looked it, a big man who had been athletic in his younger years and was now settled into a thicker frame. He had a mechanic's tan on his forearms and a careful, guarded expression that appeared within about 2 seconds of seeing Frank Weller step out of the cruiser. He looked at Clara next. Something moved in his face that was not quite guilt, too old for that. Too many years past the point where guilt was a fresh sensation but something adjacent to it, recognition. The thing you feel when the consequences of a choice you made a long time ago finally arrive in your driveway. Clara, he said. Pete, she said. Steve had stepped to the side, near the entrance to the barn, looking at the motorcycles inside with the quiet attention he gave to everything. We found some papers, Weller said. In Earl's saddlebag. Lang said nothing. Papers that describe what Earl found on your machine before the Creekside Classic, Weller continued. A brake caliper. Incorrectly mounted. End. Lang looked past Weller for a moment, at the horizon over the road, as if calculating the distance to somewhere. It wasn't what you think, he said. Tell me what it was, Weller said. It was an accident, Lang said. His voice was controlled, but it cost him something. My pitman had fitted the caliper and torqued it wrong. We didn't know. Earl found it. He fixed it. He didn't say a word to me about it. So you knew, Clara said. I suspected, Lang said. After the race, when I heard what had happened to Garrett's machine, and then when people started talking about Earl, I suspected that he'd been on my bike. I didn't know why. I thought maybe he was. He stopped. I thought maybe he was trying to do to my machine what somebody did to Garrett's, and I said as much. To a few people. The air in the driveway was very still. You didn't know he'd fixed it, Clara said. And instead of finding out what actually happened, you let people believe the worst. I know, Lang said. You said it to a few people, Weller said. You knew how small towns work. I know, Lang said again. And Calder, Steve said from near the entrance. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. He was looking at a motorcycle inside the barn that had nothing to do with anything, but his voice carried perfectly. Calder reached out to you when he heard about the Triumph being available. Lang looked at him. He had not been introduced to the man in the leather jacket and was only now, in the stress of the moment, looking at him carefully. He looked. His expression changed in the specific way expressions change when you recognize someone you did not expect to see. "He found me," Lang said quietly, as if a different question had been asked. "Calder. He collects British machines from that era. He'd heard about the Maddox Triumph. He asked me about it. And you told him about the Saddlebag," Steve said. A pause. "I told him it might be worth looking at," Lang said. "You told him there might be papers in it," Steve said. Still not loud. Just certain. Lang said nothing, which was its own answer. Tommy was standing beside his grandmother. He was looking at Pete Lang with the direct, uncomplicated stare of someone young enough to not have learned to soften their face yet. "My grandfather fixed your brake caliper," Tommy said, "and you let people call him a cheat." Lang looked at the boy. He did not argue. The argument was not there. Weller asked Lang to come back to town with them. Lang did not refuse. He said he needed a few minutes to lock the shop. They waited. He came out 5 minutes later, in a clean work shirt, and got into his truck without speaking, and followed the cruiser. They gathered in the back room of the diner, Clara's choice, not Weller's, because Clara had said she would rather be somewhere comfortable than somewhere official. Ruthie Bell closed the front blinds and put coffee on, and did not ask questions she wasn't invited to ask. She moved with the focused quiet of a woman who has waited years for something to be said out loud in her town. The 3 pages from Earl's envelope were laid on the table. Weller read through them a second time, carefully, while Lang sat across from Clara and looked at the table surface and occasionally at the papers. "The receipt," Weller said. He held it up. "OEM mounting bolts. 2 of them. Earl bought them specifically. He knew the original bolt was damaged." "He didn't tell me," Lang said. "He didn't tell anyone," Clara said. "That was Earl. He fixed what needed fixing and didn't wait for credit. The caliper on my machine was correct on race day," Lang said. "I noticed that. After the race, I mean. I checked everything after, because of what happened to Garrett. And my caliper was right. I should have asked why. I told myself maybe my pitman had corrected it. I didn't ask. Because asking would have required admitting what you'd already said to people," Weller said. Lang nodded. Steve had not sat down. He stood near the counter with a coffee cup in hand that Ruthie had brought without being asked, and he watched this part of the conversation with the patience of a man who understands that some things need to unfold at their own pace and cannot be hurried. He was also, quietly, thinking about Calder. The collector had not committed a crime, exactly. He had made a very low offer for a motorcycle. He had not stolen anything. He had not threatened anyone. What he had done was engage Pete Lang to identify papers that could damage a dead man's restored reputation, and then attempt to purchase those papers along with the machine. Whether that constituted anything actionable was a question for people with legal training, but the practical truth was simpler. Calder had tried to buy the last defense of Earl Maddox for $20, and he had failed. "The papers need to stay with Clara," Steve said. Weller looked up. "They're hers," Steve said. "They were Earl's. Whatever happens next, legally or otherwise, the papers stay with the family." Weller nodded. "Agreed. I'm not seizing anything. I'm not opening a case file tonight. What I am going to do is write down everything that's been said and think carefully about what obligations I have here." "That sounds familiar," Ruthie said from behind the counter. She set a coffee cup down in front of Lang without asking if he wanted it. She had opinions about people who made things harder for others, and she had opinions about people who tried to make it right, and she generally found that fresh coffee was the appropriate response to both. Weller absorbed this. "I know," he said. "I should have thought more carefully in 1964. I can't do anything about that now except try to do better with what's in front of me." It was not a stirring admission. It was a plain one. That made it slightly more valuable. Tommy was sitting next to Clara. He had the photograph in front of him, the one from the Saddlebag, the black and white image of Earl at the start line with Pete Lang visible behind him. He had been looking at it off and on for the past 20 minutes. "Is there anything that can be done?" Tommy asked. He meant the question broadly for Earl's name, for the town, for the version of the story that everyone had been telling. Steve looked at him. "Yes," he said. He looked at Ruthie. "Is there a newspaper in this town?" "The Sycamore Weekly," she said. "Tommy Graham runs it. He's honest enough." "And the racing association that ran the Creekside Classic," Steve said. "Who runs that now?" "It folded in '67, Weller said. "But there's the Valley Riders Club up in Hanford. They have records going back." Steve set his coffee cup down. "The records from 1964 would show who placed accusations," he said, "and what was found or not found." "I can make calls," Weller said. "So can I," Steve said. Vincent Calder left Sycamore Flats that evening. Before he walked out of Barlow's garage, he stood for a moment near the entrance and looked at the Triumph one last time. Then, at the saddlebag open, emptied, its contents spread on the seat where anyone could see them. His face showed nothing readable. He was a man who had spent years making sure his face showed nothing readable, and the habit held even now. He picked up his briefcase and his driving gloves and walked out without making another offer because there was nothing left to offer for and nowhere left to go with it. He returned the Lincoln Continental to the rental company in Visalia and flew back to San Diego. He did not contact Clara Maddox again. Whether he understood that his position had collapsed or simply understood that it had become unprofitable, the result was the same. He was gone by nightfall. Pete Lang did not leave. That was, perhaps, the more important thing. He sat in Ruthie Bell's diner for 2 hours and answered Weller's questions and Clara's questions and a few he hadn't expected from Tommy, and he told the truth in the halting, incomplete way that men tell the truth when they have spent years avoiding it, not lying exactly, but leaving things out, smoothing things over, choosing silences that were convenient. The truth that came out in that back room was not dramatic. It was ordinary and painful and recognizable, the kind of ordinary moral failure that requires no villain to be damaging. He had seen something and chosen the easy version. He had felt guilty about it, vaguely, for 6 years, and had found ways to be busy whenever the guilt appeared. He had passed along the information about the saddlebag to Calder, partly because Calder had asked, and partly, if he was honest, because some part of him had hoped the papers would simply disappear. He told Tommy he was sorry. He said it directly, to the boy, not to Clara or Weller or the room generally. He said it because Tommy was the one who had to carry this forward, who had to decide what kind of weight Earl Maddox's name would be in his life. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he was sorry, and then he was quiet, and Tommy looked at him for a long time and then looked at the photograph. Steve McQueen spent 2 days in Sycamore Flats. He did not advertise this. Ruthie Bell kept his name to herself, which he appreciated. He fixed his own carburetor in Hank Barlow's garage. Hank watched him work and said very little, which was appropriate, and he made several phone calls from the payphone outside the diner. One call was to a friend in the racing world who knew the Valley Riders Club and the men who kept records. Another was to a lawyer he trusted to ask a question about what could and could not be done with 6-year-old informal accusations. A third was to a journalist in Los Angeles who covered human interest stories for one of the larger papers and who Steve thought might be interested in what had happened to a mechanic named Earl Maddox in a small California town in 1964. None of these calls were dramatic. They were practical. They were the calls of a man who understood that the world operates through connections and leverage, and who was willing to use his own in the direction of someone who deserved it. By the second morning, 3 things had happened. Weller had filed a formal note into the county record, correcting the 1964 incident summary, attaching copies of the papers from the saddlebag and his own account of the conversations in the diner and the garage. It was a bureaucratic act, small and slow, but permanent. The record would no longer say what it had said before. The Valley Riders Club had pulled their records and found, as Steve had suspected, that the 1964 accusation against Earl Maddox had been based entirely on second- and third-hand accounts, none of which were confirmed, and that no formal investigation had been completed. The club's current secretary, a man named Gerald, was embarrassed and said so. He sent a letter to Clara that was formal but sincere, and Tommy Maddox had done something on his own. He had walked over to the garage on Birch Road early in the morning, before Hank opened, and used the key Clara gave him to go inside. He had found a bucket and a clean rag and a bottle of metal polish. And he had spent 2 hours polishing the chrome on his grandfather's Triumph until it came back not to new, it would never be new, but to what it was gleaming, where it should gleam, the cream of the tank bright against the black of the frame, the leather of the saddlebag darker now that someone had worked conditioner into it. When Steve came in at 9 o'clock to collect his own bike, he found the Triumph standing without its tarp in the center of the bay, and Tommy sitting on a stool beside it with his hands on his knees. The boy looked at him. "It's a good machine," Tommy said. "It is," Steve said. "Could it run again?" Steve walked over and crouched beside the engine. He looked at it for a moment, pressing a thumb against the fuel line, checking the float chamber. With the right carburetor kit and fresh seals and someone who knows what they're doing, he said, "Yes." Tommy nodded. Steve stood. "You know what you're doing?" Tommy asked. Steve looked at him steadily. "A little," he said. 3 weeks after Steve McQueen left Sycamore Flats, a package arrived at Barlow's garage addressed to Tommy Maddox. Inside was a carburetor rebuild kit for a 1963 Triumph Bonneville T120, the correct specification, new in its packaging. There was no note, no return address. Only a receipt showing it had been ordered from a supplier in Burbank and paid for in full. Tommy showed it to Clara that evening. She held the kit for a long time, turned it over in her hands, and looked at her grandson. Neither of them said anything, because the moment already contained what needed to be said. They worked on the Triumph through the rest of that summer, Tommy and Hank Barlow together, on Saturday mornings mostly. Hank showed up without being asked, handed Tommy tools, talked about the engine, and did not try to make it into a speech. There was no speech. There was the work. That was the shape his making amends took, and Tommy understood it for what it was. Clara came sometimes. She sat near the doorway where the afternoon light was good, and occasionally looked up at the Triumph and at the boy's hands moving over it with a patience that reminded her of someone. The journalist from Los Angeles ran his story in early September. It named Earl Maddox correctly and without apology. It named Pete Lang, and quoted Frank Weller, and quoted Gerald from the Valley Riders Club, who had pulled the 1,964 records and found nothing that supported the accusation and said so plainly. Ruthie Bell was quoted at the end. She said that Earl Maddox was the finest mechanic Sycamore Flats ever had, and that the worst thing about what happened to him was that he had already known it, and he hadn't needed anyone to tell him. The editor kept that line. Ruthie felt that was the right decision. Pete Lang did not contest the story. He was doing something slower and quieter, going back to the people he had spoken to in 1964, one by one, and telling them the correct version. It was not heroic. It was appropriate. On a Saturday in late September, with the light coming gold through the high windows of Barlow's garage, Tommy Maddox primed the fuel system and reset the ignition timing on his grandfather's Triumph for the first time. Clara was there. Ruthie Bell was there, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her coffee cup. Weller had driven by on his afternoon loop, seen the garage door open, understood, and stopped. Hank stood to the side. His hands were clean for once. Tommy kicked the starter. The engine turned. It caught on the second kick. The sound began as a complaint, rough, uncertain, the sound of something waking up after a long sleep, and then it found itself, and the idle smoothed, and the sound became what it was supposed to be. A Triumph Bonneville T120 running as it was meant to run, the garage filled with it. Clara walked to the motorcycle slowly. She put her hand on the tank, not gripping it, just resting her palm flat against the warm metal, feeling the vibration move through her. She did not say anything. Nobody did. The engine said it. The sound of a machine built carefully by a man who believed that honest work was its own argument. The sound of 6 years of silence answered. Tommy sat on the motorcycle for the first time. He put his hands on the grips and felt the engine beneath him, steady and precise, and he understood the way you understand the things that matter most, not with language but with your whole body, who Earl Maddox had been. Not a cheat, not the story the town had told. A man who found a dangerous brake caliper on another rider's machine before a race, fixed it without saying a word, wrote it down, sealed it in an envelope, and put it in his saddlebag. A man who drove this motorcycle on weekend roads, not because he needed to win, but because an honest engine on an open road was the closest thing he knew to peace. The Triumph ran. Steve McQueen was already a mile out of town when Tommy kicked that starter. He didn't know the engine had caught, and he didn't need to. He had done what he came to do, which was not what he had intended to do when he pulled into Barlow's with a lean stumble in his carburetor. But that was how these things worked, sometimes. He rode north through the valley as the afternoon light went long, and gold over the flat land, the road quiet, the air warm, and he did not think about Sycamore Flats in a sentimental way. He just rode. The way Earl Maddox used to ride, because the engine was honest, and the road was honest, and in those two things together was something that didn't need a name. Tommy kept that photograph for the rest of his life. Earl at the start line, Pete Lang behind him. He kept it because it told the true version, and because the day Steve McQueen opened that saddlebag was the day Tommy stopped being ashamed of being a Maddox and started understanding what the name was actually worth.